Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Bill Clinton says today's 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement should be celebrated, not for what happened, but for what can happen. The former US president and his peace envoy, George Mitchell, who brokered the historic deal, will both receive the Freedom of Belfast today. But with uncertainty looming over the Irish border post-Brexit, and still no power-sharing government in Stormont, these are uncertain times in Belfast. I've spoken to Senator Mitchell, and we'll hear from him and the former Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern live in just a moment. First, though, a few minutes ago, I spoke to Tony Blair, and before we got onto the subject of Northern Ireland, I pressed him on the UK's relationship with Russia, both over Syria and the nerve agent attack. I asked him whether he thought there was any chance Russia didn't carry out the attack.
No.
Why?
Because I think it's pretty obvious from all the assembled evidence, and I know that the UK authorities have looked at it very closely, and the American authorities have looked at it very closely, and others too. So I don't think you'd be getting this degree of international action unless there was a fair degree of consensus as to what's happened.
How do you feel when Sergei Lavrov and Putin raised the whole question of the dodgy dossier in Iraq and weapons of mass destruction to try and discredit the British case?
I think they're just using it as a distraction, which is pretty obvious, but it doesn't. I mean, there's, by the way, absolutely no doubt that these people have been subject to poisoning in that way. So the only question is, you know, who is responsible for creating the agent and authorizing the action?
I mean, you don't feel embarrassed that the whole history, if you like, of your premiership has damaged Britain's integrity?
I don't think it has, by the way. I think you're completely wrong about that. But in any event, it's got nothing to do with this case. And I think most people understand that when it's being raised in order that they don't have to deal with the central question.
And Russia, of course, is backing Syria, the Assad regime. Do you think the UK should join in military action with the Americans without resorting to a vote in the British Parliament?
Well, they don't strictly need one, and we're not talking about ground action here. This would be action in support of military intervention by the US, and on the assumption that the evidence that our military and our services have is the same as that of the US, then I think if you don't respond to this, to the use of chemical weapons against civilians, then obviously, you know, we're ignoring what the international community has said, which is that this is unacceptable and those that use such methods should be held to account, and we're giving carte blanche for future use of chemical weapons. So, you know, I think it's a pretty simple equation. I don't think it solves, however, even if we take the action, which I think we will have to do, it doesn't solve the longer term question of what happens in Syria.
Some dispute following Michael Wolff's book. Are you advising the Trump administration at all?
Well, there isn't any dispute. I mean, the book is just a load of old nonsense, frankly, and as I've said constantly. So, no, I'm not advising them.
Right, let's move on to the Good Friday Agreement. Owen Paterson on the Conservative side says that he believes it's outlived its usefulness. Barry Gardiner for Labour says it's a shibboleth. Does it still matter?
Well, it does matter greatly. I mean, I'm not sure that Barry really said that or meant that in that way, but for those people who say that the Good Friday Agreement doesn't matter, they should just remember what things were like. I mean, before we signed the agreement in April 1998, it was 20 years we commemorate today. Before then, we had decades. And, you know, you remember, I remember what it was like waking up every morning to tales of death and destruction, terrorism, sectarianism, hatred. People remember what Belfast was like at that moment, what it was like when you visited Northern Ireland. And the Good Friday Agreement gave us the chance to put an end to all of that. And 20 years on, yes, you still got big challenges and big problems. If you compare where we are to where ideally, in an ideal world, we want to be, we haven't got there yet. But if you compare it to where we were during the Troubles, I mean, I think it would be strange and foolish to say anything other than that the Good Friday Agreement had a beneficial impact and we should try and preserve it.
And does it still work with Brexit, with Britain outside of that partnership with Ireland within the EU?
Well, Brexit poses a challenge. I mean, it's one that can be overcome and should be overcome. So, you know, I don't take the view that because of Brexit, the Good Friday Agreement can't be maintained. But it poses a challenge because for 100 years, since the creation of the Republic of Ireland and the partition between North and South of Ireland, the UK and the Republic of Ireland have always been in the same relationship as each other to Europe. So for the first 50 years or so, we were outside of Europe, both of us, and then we joined on the same day in 1973, and it was no coincidence we joined on the same day. It was in order to keep the trade and the commerce and the free movement of people between North and South. Then for the last 45 years, obviously, we've been together in the European Union. So for the first time, the Republic and the UK will be in a different relationship to Europe, and that north-south border will be the border between the UK and the European Union. So obviously that poses a challenge because the whole part of the Good Friday Agreement was to say North and South were in a relationship of closeness and free movement between the two parts of Ireland, and that in a sense allowed the nationalist community to have the aspiration of a united Ireland even whilst the North remained inside the UK. So there is a challenge. We're going to have to try and overcome it. We should overcome it, but you know, there's no, you can't deny it. It is an additional factor that is going to complicate things.
But what's the answer on the border question if, as Mrs May says, the red line is to be out of the customs union and out of the single market?
Well, that's difficult. But she's also agreed a backstop, which I think will be very difficult for the UK, by the way, if we can't reach agreement. So I think we're going to have to look at how we manage to minimise the friction between North and South if Brexit goes ahead. And, you know, this will be challenging because literally you've got a border roughly 260 miles long. You've got thousands of trucks and vehicles that go across it every day, people that go across it every day. If you go down to that border area, I mean, most people are crossing the border several times a day. Or many people are, and it just, you know, if you put in a hard border there, it's going to cause a big problem. Now, I'm sure the government will do all that it can to avoid that, but it is a problem because once you come out of the single market for Europe, then, you know, so far as goods are concerned at least, you've obviously not got the same access as when you're in the single market.
Finally, of course, the DUP did not sign up to the Good Friday Agreement when you reached that agreement. They are now in a pact with the British government. Do you think that the Conservative and Unionist Party, as led by Mrs May, is committed to the Good Friday Agreement, really?
Yes, I think she is. I mean, I look, obviously, a lot of people will look at the fact that this government now stays in power with the support of the DUP and say, well, how can they be independent or objective-minded in relation to Northern Ireland? But I do believe that she is sincere in her desire to preserve the Good Friday Agreement and to keep the relationship between the UK and the Republic strong. So, I mean, I think whatever the difficulties of you know, the arithmetic of the House of Commons, the loss of the Good Friday Agreement, or if we weakened it in a fundamental way, I mean, the implications of that are so devastating that I am sure the government will do everything they can to avoid them.
Mr Blair, thank you for joining us. Well, that was one signatory to the Belfast Agreement, and joining us now is the other, the former Taoiseach, Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern. He's live from Belfast. Mr Ahern, thank you for being with us. Given Brexit, how relevant do you think the Good Friday Agreement is today?
Good morning, Adam. No, it's as relevant today as it was this day 20 years ago. It was designed to stop the Troubles, to bring peace to Northern Ireland. We'd had a period of 15,500 bombs, of 37,000 shootings, 3,700 people killed, 47,500 criminal actions. And the agreement was to stop that, to stop the trouble, stop the violence, and to try and move to a new political settlement, and to try to deal with the issues of decommissioning of arms, the thousands of prisoners that were in jail, to reform the policing, the Patton report, which happened after it, and the whole parity of esteem, the criminal justice, the human rights, the Equality Acts, all of that's happened. We have still difficulties with one aspect of it, the institutional arrangements, but quite frankly, looking at the kind of items that we dealt with over the years, are not to minimise the other things that are outstanding, but it should be doable to solve those out over the months ahead.
I mean, the common membership of the European Union is written into the Belfast Agreement. When that ceases, when the UK leaves the European Union, do you think that will endanger that parity of esteem which you talk about between the two communities?
I don't, Adam. I think the Good Friday Agreement, the institutional arrangements around the Intergovernmental Council should be used to replace the relationship that has been there for the last 45 years between the United Kingdom and Ireland. In the 20 years that I attended European Council meetings, either as Social Affairs Council, ECOFIN Council as Finance Minister, or my 3 terms as Taoiseach, I built up very good relationships with both Tory and Labour ministers, and so did all my predecessors and successors. That unfortunately ends next March. The contact and the relationship that has changed the 800 years dynamics between our two countries goes. So I think what we need a replacement, and in this case we don't have to look for a replacement. It's there in the Good Friday Agreement. It's there in the Intergovernmental Council, and I would suggest that every quarter or so the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister and ministers should meet and discuss issues. They don't all have to be there for every meeting, but there should be regular meetings between the UK and Ireland, and to keep the relationship and the friendship and the fact that we're close neighbours together, and not go back to the kind of relationship we had for 8 centuries.
And does a hard border of some kind of border checks, have to be avoided at all costs, and if so, why?
Yes, Adam, any kind of a border, hard, soft, sunny side up, as I had said, or any other one, it won't be there anyway. The people, if you try to put any kind of a physical border, you're not going to have a return to violence. The people just wouldn't allow them to construct it. Ordinary civic society wouldn't allow them. So we're not going to have a hard border. So I think we have to negotiate, the two governments, the European Union, an arrangement that means that the frictionless non-border that we have today, where we move freely around the island of Ireland, remains. Now, I think it's in the interests of course, it's in the interests of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. It's the state position of every political party. The people in Northern Ireland voted against Brexit, but I accept Brexit is there, and hopefully there is a customs union of some sort that is fairly close to the one that's currently there, because I think that's, in my view, that's in the interests of the United Kingdom, because I don't think any country in the world is going to do a better deal with the United Kingdom than the deals that those countries already do with the European Union. I mean, why would any country do a better trade deal with a country of 80 million that they already have with a country of 450 million? So, I think in the cold light of day, when these things are looked at by David Davies and his colleagues, that they will see there's something close to the customs union. I don't care whether it's called Sky News or Bertie Ahern News or whatever you have yourself, but I hope it's similar to what is there present, and that will mean that we won't have any necessity for a border in the island of Ireland.
Because of course you've got things this morning like Michael Gove talking about wanting to end the live export and import of animals, of farm animals. Well, I mean, the consequence of that for farmers across the border would be impossible, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think if you get on into all of these kind of issues, and if you look at them, and I've been involved, and I know, Adam, you've been talking about this now for 2 years, but the more you go through it, and you look at the how trade would operate on the island of Ireland, or from the EU into the UK, and tariffs and impediments, like it's senseless, and it's mind-boggling what you could end up with, when there's a far easier alternative. And I've been watching carefully what the negotiators are saying and what they're saying in the trade deals. I don't see anything coming out of the UK negotiators, and they're all bright and clever people, that is going to wreck the arrangements that they currently have with the European Union. And Brexit, from my position, I know some people are delighted with it. They think it's terrific, but I think it's just crazy. But we have to make it work, and the way to make it work is to try and keep it as close to the customs union as we possibly can. And that'll be good for Europe. It'll be good for the United Kingdom, and it'll certainly be good for the island of Ireland, north and south.
But well, the Good Friday Agreement, something to celebrate today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And later on in All Out Politics, around about 10:45, going to hear from George Mitchell, who of course was the former senator who brokered that agreement. Well, to mark today's 20th anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, I've been speaking to the US Senator George Mitchell, who pulled it off. He chaired the negotiations which led to the deal. I started by asking him how difficult it was to get to that point.
It was an extremely difficult and challenging time. I spent a total of about 5 years working on the process in Northern Ireland. I chaired 3 separate but related sets of discussions. The main negotiation lasted about 2 years, and the final 2 weeks were extremely intense after I had set an unbreakable deadline for Easter weekend in 1998. And finally, at the very end, right at the last minute, we were able to come through with an agreement. It was a close-run thing, but thankfully it produced what has been 2 decades largely of peace in Northern Ireland.
That was the aim, was it, to bring peace, or was it to build a more inclusive Northern Ireland where the 2 sections of society were sharing the running of the country together?
On the evening that I announced the agreement 20 years ago, I said that it was an historic achievement, which it was. But I also said on that day that by itself the agreement did not guarantee peace or political stability or reconciliation. It made them possible. But I knew that there were decades of challenges ahead. Indeed, every human life is changed, and the lives of societies change, and so no agreement can fix for all time the problems that a society has. It takes a long time to change what's in people's hearts and minds. That's really the most important thing, and I think it will be generations before that occurs. But the essential predicate for that is the absence of widespread violence, and I think that's been the case for the past 20 years, and I hope over time there will come the genuine reconciliation and trust to the extent that it exists in the political process.
How great do you think the danger is of a reversion to violence, particularly, of course, given Brexit and the likelihood of some kind of border returning between North and South?
I don't believe there will or should be a return to violence. I believe that the overwhelming majority of people of Northern Ireland, in all communities, don't want to go back to the troubles or trying to solve problems through violence. I believe that the overwhelming majority of the people of Northern Ireland want peace, prosperity, and ultimately reconciliation. I think it's important to keep in mind that the government of the United Kingdom and the European Union months ago publicly announced their commitment that whatever the outcome of Brexit, It will not include a return to a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That's the solemn promise of the British government. And we who care about Northern Ireland should accept that promise and insist that it be kept. That's an essential prerequisite to moving forward in Northern Ireland and on Brexit itself.
But Brexit does inevitably separate Dublin from Westminster, doesn't it? Because Britain and Ireland will no longer be part of the same European Union partnership.
I believe that the existence of the European Union helped end a half-century or more of cold relations between the United Kingdom and Ireland. And I think it was an important factor in leading the two governments to work together to create the conditions that led to peace in Northern Ireland. So I believe that the UK leaving the European Union is unfortunate both for the people of the United Kingdom and for Ireland. But it is a democratically taken decision which therefore must be respected. I hope, however, that there will still continue to be good relations between the United Kingdom and Ireland because their economies are deeply integrated. And in fact, it's more important for the people of Ireland, a small nation of about 5 million people, to still have access, trade, and good relations with the UK, a large and powerful nation of 65 million people. And so my hope is for both sides, continued good relations and continued working together, whatever the outcome of the Brexit negotiations.
Some people have suggested there needs to be another intervention by the United States, perhaps yourself or someone else going to the island of Ireland as a special envoy. Do you think that is necessary, would be helpful at this stage?
That's a determination to be made by the governments of the United Kingdom and Ireland and the political leaders of Northern Ireland. History is littered with examples where outside intervention was not helpful. History also has examples where outside intervention was very helpful. There is no general rule that can apply uniformly to any conflict or difficult situation, and it's a judgment to be made by the current leaders, just as the decision to obtain my involvement back in 1998 was made by John Major and the then Prime Minister of Ireland. And I leave it to the current leadership to make that determination.
In another 20 years, do you think there will still be a Northern Ireland as part of the UK, or will the island of Ireland be united?
The Good Friday Agreement left that decision to the people of Northern Ireland themselves, as is fitting and appropriate in a democratic society. They will decide their future, just as the people of the United States will decide our future, just as the people of the United Kingdom will decide their future. That's the appropriate thing to do. That's what the agreement provides, and it will be up to the people of Northern Ireland to decide how and in what circumstances they want to live out their futures.
Senator George Mitchell.
20 years to the day. Can you believe it? 20 years to the day since the Good Friday Agreement. I remember it like it was yesterday. That's when it was signed, ending 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland. Later this afternoon, former US President Bill Clinton and his peace envoy, Senator George Mitchell, you'll probably recognise the other guy at the end as well, don't you? Brokered the deal with the Irish Prime Minister, Irish Prime Minister. Remind me which one he was. I'm sure you'll email me. He was the Prime Minister, wasn't he? I'm sure he was. I'm sure if I'm wrong, Twitter's head will explode, but I think he was the Prime Minister in Belfast. Other key players, including, as you saw, the Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, and the former Sinn Féin leader, Gerry Adams, are in Belfast alongside Senator Mitchell, reflecting on their achievement in 1998. The Good Friday Agreement is now used as a blueprint for solving other conflicts around the world. Signed by Bertie Ahern and the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. They've both been speaking to Sky News about the relevance of the deal today. Let's go straight across to Belfast. They're on stage right now.
You were, along with the Taoiseach and the President, were very deeply involved in the negotiations that led to the agreement. You and the Taoiseach were here for the last week. We all recall some of it fondly. And I'd like to ask for your thoughts and recollections on the significance of those events, what has transpired since then up to the present time, and what you would most like to remember, and perhaps also where you felt we didn't quite make the grade. So in whatever form you like to, please proceed.
Well, Senator Mitchell, George, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here, and particularly to be here with these three people. George, without your work in the run-up to that negotiation 20 years ago, we frankly would never have had anything to negotiate about. So thank you for that. To Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach, I recall during the whole of that negotiation his total dedication. Even when he had a personal bereavement, he came and he gave his time and his effort and his intelligence and his energy to finding peace. And also to President Clinton, who we're delighted to see here, because he was the call a friend during the course of the negotiation. I mean, when anything got really, really difficult, we'd pick up the phone and ask him to help. And I do remember at one point, because as the days went on, you became slightly disoriented with the negotiation, saying to my folk, "They are 5 hours ahead over there." They said, "No, they're 5 hours behind." So that was 3 o'clock in the morning, but he was up and alive and willing to give us the benefit of his advice. So I would like to give some brief opening remarks in this way. For me, this began personally in my own childhood when I was growing up, when we used to spend every summer in Donegal. And when I remember as the Troubles began in the late 60s, my family that used to have close relationships, although they were from a Protestant background with their Catholic neighbors, how as those Troubles began, those relationships soured. And then we entered into this period of hatred and bitterness and division and terrorism and sectarianism, which then lasted for many, many years. And so those of us who used to remember what things were like before the Troubles and then remember the Troubles, remember what a terrible period it was. And I remember when we came to power in May 1997, at that point, the ceasefire that John Major had put together with a lot of wisdom and energy had broken down. And I actually remember the very first speech that I made as Prime Minister was here in Northern Ireland, really to the Unionist community. And so we began what was almost a year lead-in to that Good Friday negotiation. But even when we got to the negotiation, it was very touch and go as to whether anything was going to happen at all. I remember you and I discussing that at the time, George, and thinking it looked pretty hopeless. But then over the days that followed, we managed to put this together. And we put it together not because of the work that we did, but because there were political leaders in Northern Ireland who were prepared to make real sacrifices and show real courage in the search for peace. But the important thing is this: when we reached that agreement and then announced it, that was the beginning. And I think this is really important in the context of today. We didn't conclude the Good Friday Agreement and then everything was gentle and easy and comfortable. On the contrary, then over the next 9 years, I remember sometimes every month, sometimes every week, sometimes every day, we were working at it again. And we were going back and having meetings, sometimes short meetings, sometimes long meetings. And we were dealing with the new police service in Northern Ireland. We were dealing with decommissioning. We were dealing with criminal justice matters, with cultural matters. And my point is, when we then came to that moment in May 2007, when the executive came up and running, and the extraordinary sight of Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley sitting down together, that was the culmination of a long
Okay, coming back in and out of this debate for you throughout the afternoon, leaving the former Prime Minister there just for now. I want to hear from Bill Clinton in the fullness of time. Also want to talk about Syria. Prime Minister under pressure to take action after France and the US vowed to retaliate against the Assad regime following a suspected chemical attack. Joined by Johnny Mercer, Conservative MP and former serviceman. Hello to you, Mr Mercer. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Just before we talk about Syria, quick thought on Good Friday Agreement. 20 years ago it was signed.
I know, it's extraordinary and amazing that that amount of time has passed. And, you know, it's clearly, you'll have its critics, and some people will think it's held, and some people will think it's won't. But I think, you know, it has fundamentally shifted the dial of what living in Northern Ireland means for a whole generation of young people. And it's extraordinary to think it's 20 years, and it's great to hear all the protagonists there really sort of recounting it. It's fascinating.
Shifting the dial on living in Syria, of course, was, some people would say, our lack of intervention by the British Parliament when the Americans came to us to say, come with us on this. You wrote about that, didn't you, in the paper this week? Not at all impressed by that decision by the British government.
No, I mean, you know, I feel desperately for David Cameron, for George Osborne and everyone involved in it. I think at the time I said I thought it would be perhaps the most profound foreign policy mistake we've made in the last decade, but I think it's probably going to be longer than that. So I think clearly, look, everybody understands the hangover from Iraq and the mistakes were made, but we kind of, you know, we learn from that. We change, we establish a National Security Council, we make sure we never repeat the mistakes again, but it certainly doesn't mean we become a little Britain that just retreats and has this sort of insular view of itself. Our friends and our allies expect us to play a role. It's certainly concerning that France and the US, you know, they're very strong on this, and we haven't really said we're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with them yet. I hope that's going to come out. This is, you know, sometimes you have to stand up for what you believe in and what you think is right, and this is a clear moment for that. William Hague has said again today in the Telegraph, you know, this is our moment. Sometimes you have to step up to the plate, and no one's calling for a full-scale military invasion. You know, war doesn't work like that anymore. But we cannot stand by and let this sort of thing happen.
Who do you blame for our previous lack of intervention?
Well, I think we're all to blame in a way. I mean, certainly coming from the services, you sort of look on in amusement at some of the debates that go on and the detail that goes on. But if you look at the fundamental principle of Parliament having a say on foreign security issues, those decisions are made in full picture of all the intelligence that is never going to be revealed to Parliament, that is never going to be revealed to the public because you'll burn your sources and the way you go about intelligence collecting. Ultimately, it's for the Prime Minister to make that decision. Now, I understand why David Cameron did that in 2013. The hangover from Iraq has been long and very, very painful, and some serious mistakes there. But now we've got to move on. We've got to, you know, get with the pace. Warfare is changing. Foreign policy is changing. We need to get with the pace, keep up, because otherwise we'll get left behind. And I'm not, you know, like many of my colleagues, prepared to settle for a Britain that just settles into irrelevance. That's not who we are. It's not who we have been in the past. And, you know, this is one of those issues that we need to step up to the plate on.
The Prime Minister was not supported, David Cameron not supported by the Labour Party, which is the opposition, which is why that motion failed. How easily would you sleep in your bed if you were Ed Miliband?
Look, I have some private views on that, but I'm not going to make them public. I think you know, it's pretty clear, I think, to everybody how that situation has materialised. You know, what assertions he may give him before the recall of Parliament. I think where we are is a very sad place, and those are questions for him to answer. Yeah.
So, but you weren't that impressed.
Well, of course not. You know, you know, the situation where we are now is horrific in Syria. It was horrific then as well. There were no easy options, but back then there was an opportunity. And in this country, you know, we are very quick to become pious over Iraq and talk about how difficult foreign intervention is and how, you know, there are no, you know, clean outcomes, and so we shouldn't get involved. And it's just not the reality of warfare. If we are going to play a role on the world stage that many of us think we should, we need to understand how it's changed, advocate for the British people as to how it's changed, and show that we actually stand up for something on this. I suspect the US and the French are going to do that, and I'll be sorely disappointed if we don't stand shoulder to shoulder with them, and that they're aware of that at the moment.
Well, the situation could have been very different in Syria if we had intervened previously.
Well, I think it would have been different. It's hard to, sort of look back through, with rose-tinted glasses and think things would have changed. I mean, clearly the situation has got a lot worse. That intervention, I think, was the biggest foreign policy mistake we've seen. I think even bigger than Iraq, which, if we look back on now and look at the catalogue of errors that were made then. But, Tony Blair and people going through that process then, they were making deliberate decisions that they thought were in the best interest of what was going on. I think what happened with that vote in Syria is you had individuals who, some of them were entirely legitimate MPs who'd been asked to vote for Iraq and felt burned by that, and Libya and felt burned by that. And I entirely understand those, but I'm afraid there was a whole swathe of particularly Labour politicians who took the moment to sort of stand on the plinth and shoot down the government. And I think when you do that and you put the your own personal interest before the national interest, you're going to end up in a pretty bad place, and certainly that's what's happened over Syria.
But democracy means that on this occasion, diplomacy was viewed to be the best way forward. What about now?
Well, actually, that vote fell because Assad said he was going to get rid of his chemical weapons. The Russians said they were going to supervise him, and the Labour Party fell for it. I mean, I do hope at some point everyone stopped believing, the Russian lies and the Syrian lies that come out every single day. I think the naivety of relying on that is extraordinary, but there we go. People did, and the vote didn't go through in 2013. We're clearly faced with a similar issue now. And the thing is with these people, Assad and Putin, that they only respond to strength. And we don't, nobody wants to wade into a full-blown conflict. Nobody wants to see Iraq Mark II or any of that mess. But also, we don't just retreat and let them carry on. We talk in this country all the time, all you need for evil to flourish is for good men to stand by and do nothing. And then we end up doing nothing. I'm afraid for many people, that's not good enough. We have a role to play. Our friends and allies expect us to play that role. And I look forward to Britain stepping up to the plate in the next sort of 24, 48 hours.
Did you prefer being a soldier or a politician?
That's a very unfair question, isn't it? I think there were, being a politician is an enormous privilege. There are aspects of military life that I desperately miss, of course. But that's life.
When you say it's unfair, you mean you've never been asked it before?
I have been asked it before. I think that it's been politics. I never had any preconceptions of it because I never expected to be an MP. So I can't really complain if I'm surprised by some of it. It presents immense challenges, but it is enormously difficult at times to understand the way the system works. But ultimately, if you're not prepared to sort of get your hands dirty, you shouldn't have got into it in the first place. So I love the opportunities it represents. It's a real privilege voted for by people to do their bidding as they have done in Plymouth. But of course, it's laced with frustrations. And the military is a very privileged place to be. You're surrounded by often young, motivated men and women who want to be there, who abide by a set of values that you stand up for and sign up to, I'm afraid.
Yeah, would love to talk to you for hours, but I know you've got to go. Come back and talk to us soon. Thanks very much indeed, as always.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Straight back to Belfast, where they're continuing to chat. It was previously Tony Blair. It's now the Taoiseach. Bertie Ahern.
I think every day I think of it now, that's the next piece. Like, decommissioning was huge, prisoners was huge, reform of policing was massive, the whole parity of esteem in the criminal justice system, these issues. We spent years at these things with good advisors, good officials, which we remember and thank, and particularly remember those people who are no longer with us, both politicians and officials. But what's important in life, I think, and there's nothing more important than trying to stop people being killed, to let people live their life in the normal way, to educate your kids, see your kids grow, see your grandkids grow, see them work, see peace, see the city develop the way it is now. I walked the other night where I hadn't walked for 20 years. I walked with John de Chastelain down around the Titanic Quarter to see the new hotel and the developments the most iconic and best visited place in the whole world, the Titanic Centre, and then you feel that you're getting somewhere. And all as I say respectfully to the politicians, you know, big issues were resolved not by the four of us, but by everybody. There are issues remaining. I don't think that they're bigger than the issues we resolve. I'm not saying they're easy or trivialize them. And I do hope that sooner rather than later, not for us, not for legacy issues, not for anything other than the people who live on the island of Ireland, and particularly Northern Ireland, that you must see this through to the next phase. And I wish you well in doing that.
At 10 o'clock in Belfast on that Thursday evening, while we were at Stormont, ricocheting from one meeting to another, an aide came to me and said, the president's on the phone for you. And as I walked from where I was back into my office, I made the immediate calculation. It's the president calling. That began a series of calls that lasted throughout the night. Finally, at one point, it was the next morning here, and I was online. I said, it must be 3 o'clock in the morning. What are you doing? He said, oh, I can't sleep. I've got to stay involved. He was telephoning me and the prime ministers and many of the delegates who were at the talks. It was an indication of the president's deep concern about this. And I also recall, you may have forgotten this, 2 years earlier, he was facing re-election, and he called and asked me to return to the United States to assist in the preparation for his first debate with his opponent, who was the Senate minority leader, and I'd been the majority leader. And he said to me, well, you know him better than anybody. You can help in the debate preparation. So I flew from Belfast. We were at a small resort town in upstate New York, and as soon as I arrived, I went in to have dinner with the president, and staff had given me books of briefings, so I was prepared to talk about the debates. We sat down at that first dinner, and he spent the entire evening asking me questions about what was happening in Northern Ireland. On the eve of probably the most important debate in his life up until that time, we talked about Northern Ireland for about an hour and a half, a good indication of where it stood in his sense of priorities. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome my president and dear friend, Bill Clinton.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Senator Mitchell was too modest to tell you the rest of the story. After I grilled him about the situation in Northern Ireland, we had a mock debate. He played Bob Dole, and he beat my brains out. I mean, it wasn't close. It was a humiliating experience, and I thought, thank God I'm not running against George Mitchell. I did pretty good in the debate because he roughed me up so bad. I'd like to make a couple of introductory comments. First of all, when the United States tries to help someone else in a peace process, the narrower the agenda, the easier it is. For example, there was this huge, almost violence-causing boundary dispute between Peru and Ecuador that ended in the Amazon rainforest. I thought, this is nutty. These people have got a great future. So we sent somebody down there, we solved it, and my only role was to send 10 members of the U.S. military to patrol the border at the end point of the dispute in the middle of the rainforest. When I started, those 10 people all wanted to go AWOL. They thought, Bill Clinton's lost his mind, he sent me out here nowhere. By the time the whole thing was over, they never wanted to leave. Then the more people's lives are infected and the more complicated issues are, the deeper it can get. In the end, there are only two things the United States can do to help other people. Now we may need you to come help us, but in the end, we can do our very best to maximize the rewards and minimize the risks of those who are brave enough to seek peace. And then, if we're trusted, we can do our very best to listen with a friendly and caring ear to all the interests and do our best to close the gaps. That's what George did. And he was a genius at it. And I'm very grateful to him. It all started when he was leaving the Senate. I practically jumped off the bridge in Washington, D.C. when he told me he was going to leave the Senate. So I decided to punish him by giving him a part-time job as a special economic envoy to Northern Ireland, which then morphed into being the peace negotiator. And when he woke me up for the 57th time on April the 9th, I was grouching and he said, "You gave me this part-time job. Now you have to help me succeed." So I thank him. Bertie and Tony and I became close friends. Our families became friends. They were inexhaustible. I'm grateful to them. But I'd also like to say that I'm very grateful to their predecessors, to John Bruton and Albert Reynolds, and to John Major, who made this first declaration before I got involved at all in December of '92, and could well have been deposed because of it. He had a very narrow majority. And thank you, David Trimble, for not taking him down. I'm grateful to all of them, but especially to these guys. We tried to clean it up. The main things that I tried to do was to jumpstart the thing and to give it early confidence. I had become interested in Northern Ireland when I was a student at Oxford. The troubles began when I was a 22-year-old graduate student at Oxford. And all I knew was that my mother's family was Scots-Irish. They were from Fermanagh. They lived in a little house. For the oldest known farmhouse in our family is mid-1700s, just outside Rosalie. And I'm sure that my Scots-Irish Protestant forebears must have intermarried with Catholics just across the border, because I seem so genetically predisposed to try to get you together. But anyway, I cared about it. And then when I was running for president, there was a big block of people in New York who wanted the United States to get involved and appoint a special envoy. And as I prepared for this meeting, I just kept thinking, you know, the Irish diaspora is so big, and there were 44 million people of Irish descent, a huge Irish Catholic community, but an even larger Scots-Irish Protestant community. 25% of all the uniformed soldiers in the history of the United States have been Scots-Irish. And so I thought, you know, if we got organized, we ought to be able to help if there was a willingness to do it. So we started working on it. The first issue that came up is whether I should give Mr. Adams a visa. When the Sinn Féin had indicated they were interested in an end to violence. The State Department looked at me like I had lost my mind. The British press went crazy and said Bill Clinton's just trying to get even with John Major because he searched the passport files of the British government, because we all know Clinton tried to give away his passport so he could go to Russia and become a Soviet citizen to oppose the Vietnam War. Fake news did not begin day before yesterday. So anyway, so the whole thing was silly. Our ambassador to the UK at the time was a very distinguished man who risked his reputation to endorse me in 1992 when I was being attacked for my lack of military service, Admiral William Crowe, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, "You can't do this. I won't be able to do my job." I said, "Bill, if I don't do it, your job may not be very fulfilling." So I took a flying leap, and thank you, Jerry Adams, for not betraying my trust and for honoring the commitments you made. And then the thing started. It was hard for David Trimble, but he hung in there. He got a Nobel Prize, but his party lost their leadership within the center right, as often happens. I'm proud of Seamus Mallon and what he did in government when you guys stood up Stormont. I talked to John Hume's wife, Pat, today, and I thought, you know, they were the sort of spiritual home for people across the spectrum who believed there had to be an end to violence. But they knew their political position would weaken if an agreement was made, because once an agreement is made, you want the toughest people you can to work out the details. So we wound up with the famous odd couple of McGinnis and Paisley. Now that I could not have mediated. They made it work. And Peter then came along, and I thank you. I thank all of you who served. I see Mark Durkin out there and all these people. They deserve all the credit. They and the citizens groups, the women's groups, all the thousands of Irish kids who wrote me letters, and you know, that was before email. We still had lots of snail mail then, so thank God I've got records of all these letters. But here's what I want to say about it. In the wake of all this tribalism going on all over the world today, all this identity politics, all this, it's almost deeply psychological belief that there has been so much economic change and social dislocation and rearranging the deck chairs and society's hierarchies that people are pulling back. The Good Friday Agreement is the work of genius that's applicable if you care at all about preserving democracy. That's the first point I want to make. Because it called for real democracy, majority rule, minority rights, individual rights, the rule of law, the end of violence, shared political decision-making, shared economic benefits. Shared special relations, maintained the relationship with the United Kingdom, expanded the relationship with the Irish Republic, and then let the future take its course. The most interesting thing was, by creating a space for the identity and the interests and the values of all the people involved in a framework which protected democracy and let future demographic, economic, and political changes take Northern Ireland wherever it would go. It was a work of surpassing genius. And in a world today where there are people who are aggressively trying to destroy the very idea of popular democracy. It embodied everything that I believe works best. I could fill this great hall with the studies that have been done showing that diverse groups make better decisions than homogeneous ones. That compromise actually leads you on a path of progress that is more sustainable than dictation does. So what I want to say to you is, and I know George is going to do some follow-up, but do not underestimate the value of the fact that this was done by people of different parties, different persuasions, and not one damn time, as nearly as I can tell, in the whole process did anyone ever suggest that democracy itself should be abandoned, that the results of elections should not be respected, that some people's votes should be denied, discredited, or that facts were not facts. There is now a whole global industry of academic research on how democracies decline.
Okay, we seem to have lost the president. I know people call him former president, but of course, once they are president of the United States, that is not the case any longer. Talking about his relationship with Senator Mitchell and also talking about 20 years ago today. Can you believe it? 20 years ago today that the Good Friday peace agreement was signed, not only by the then President Clinton, but also involved with that, of course, was the Irish Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, and indeed our Prime Minister as well, Tony Blair. We'll go back to that just as soon as we can.